So I think we will move right to our first presenter. We will have questions after each presentation. And our first presenter is Astrid Fellner, who is Chair of North American Literary and Cultural Studies at Saarland University in Saarbrücken, Germany. She's co-speaker in the DGF-funded International Research Training Program, Diversity, Mediating Difference in Transcultural Space, in which the Université de Montréal has been involved. She's taught gender and queer theory for many years and published extensively in these fields. At Saarland U, she founded the forum Geschlechterforschung, Forum of Gender Studies, and she's the coordinator of the certificate program Gender Studies. She is the author of Articulating Selves, Contemporary Chicana Self-Representation, Bodily Sensations, the Female Body in Late 18th Century American Culture, and the co-editor of Rethinking Gender in Popular Culture in the 21st Century, Marlboro Men and California Girls. Together with Eva Nossum, she's currently editing the volume Queer Migration and Belonging, Intersections and Assemblages. And her paper today is entitled Queer in East LA, Latinx Women and the Queer Politics of TV. So I invite you to.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for organizing this beautiful conference, Joelle and Marta. Thank you very much. Let's just continue talking about the paradox, the queer paradox that we've been, or that we've gotten used to now. I've slightly changed my title. I just exchanged the women and used characters now because I thought that there's actually non-binary stuff going on here. For decades, Latinx LGBTQ plus people have hardly been represented in North American popular culture. And when they were depicted on screen, they were grossly misrepresented. For the last 12 years, GLAAD has conducted an annual, as I'm sure you all know, Where We Are on TV, that tracks the progression of LGBTQ plus representation on the small screen. As the latest installment, however, found out, while the overall number of queer characters has increased, they remain mostly white male and mostly cisgender. It's something that we've already, discussed here. Also, the Latinx population remains underrepresented in leading roles on TV. As Chelsea Condelario complained in 2018, quote, Latinx are the U.S. second largest racial group with 18% of the population, yet we only make up around 8%, just a 5% increase from 2016 of media representation. As people, citizens, moviegoers, and TV watchers, she continues, we deserve a larger share in the pop culture that we help to share. The only time that a Latina woman actually won an Emmy for a leading role was America Ferrera for Outstanding Lead Actress in a comedy series called Ugly Betty in 2007. Recently, however, we have seen a number of Latinx TV productions, and also Latinx LGBTQ plus characters are increasingly gaining more visibility on TV. In this paper, I will analyze how queer politics and Latinx identities are negotiated in recent TV series, looking into the paradox, so to speak, or actually the possibilities for resistant queer Latinx performances. I want to argue that recent TV shows like ABC's Ugly Betty or Netflix's One Day at a Time or Esparza's Vida, which feature queer characters, can be seen not only as instruments for global consumer capitalism, but also as forums for feminism, queer or Latinx activism. The characters depicted in these shows not only help push the boundaries of acceptance in film and television, but they also contribute to the cultural politics of television, the way in which the content of these shows themselves engage with the politics of their time. As was just announced, I think about 2 months ago, Netflix has canceled the popular sitcom One Day at a Time, about which I'm going to talk today, supposedly because of the show's lack of viewers. This news was met with great disappointment by the show's legions of admirers, especially its Latinx fans, and as evinced from social media, there have been several efforts to save the show. Despite the cancellation, however, Netflix has tweeted about the cultural importance of the show and how it serves underrepresented audiences, acknowledging the show's political impact. And probably this was the reason why the show got canceled, but this is something that we can talk about. Now, One Day at a Time is a show about a Cuban-American familia featuring a lesbian character in a relationship with a non-binary person. The show was not only praised for its positive representation of LGBTQ community, but also for tackling issues such as homophobia, racism, and immigration. Right now, I'd like to zoom in on this sitcom, arguing that this show performs Latinx queerness not only because of its politics of representation of queer characters, but also because of its focus on the disruption of norms and its queer politics of kinship. Drawing on David Eng's concept of queer diaspora, I want to argue that Netflix's One Day at a Time offers new ways of reconfiguring kinship to encompass alternative forms of ethnic belonging. When talking about the cultural politics of TV, some comments, however, have to be made on the representation. When discussing media representations of various groups, especially those we consider marginalized, stereotypes are often a primary concern. And I don't have to rehearse here what has already been said about stereotypical representations of Latinx on TV and the various forms of what could be called tropicalization. As is well known, Latinx are often portrayed, especially Latina women, are often portrayed as exotic seductresses or tacky and overtly emotional or as hypersexualized human beings. Now, in these representations, Latinidad, kind of like the essence of being Latino or something like that, is brought into connection with exoticism. And it is precisely the focus on the sexualized brown body that has been turned into a postmodern ethnic commodity. One Day at a Time is a show that kind of revels in Latinidad. Created by Mike Royce and Jane the Virgin's Gloria Calderon Kellett, this multi-camera sitcom was filmed in front of a live audience. It tells the story of nurse practitioner Penelope, a single mother of 2 kids, her willful feminist Elena, and stubborn Queen Alex. Now, Penelope receives plenty of help, sometimes unwanted, most of the time from her mother, Lydia. I'll turn in a moment, and her hipster landlord, Schneider. Now, the show, for those who are old enough to remember, is a remake of Norman Lear's 1975 to 84 sitcom of the same name, which starred Bonnie Franklin as a divorced mother raising 2 teenage daughters in Indianapolis. But the 2017 rendition centers on a Cuban-American family living in Echo Park in East LA. And as I've said, is headed up by a single mom and her dominating mother, Lydia, who is played by the legendary Rita Moreno. Now, in a lot of ways, this show mobilizes a crucial subversion of dominant sexual politics, heterosexual norms, you could say, and traditional forms of kinship. Clearly, the issues that the Alvarez family is facing in 2017-18 are different from the problems that the Coopers faced in 1975. Now, not only is Penelope a single mother, but she's also a military veteran, and she suffers from PTSD and constantly has to fight for resources. Lydia, her mother, in turn, cannot let go of her Cuban roots and is scared that her family will forget their heritage, which is why she outperforms Cubanness, you could say, by flaunting dance moves and displaying a rich and thick accent. Lydia is melodramatic, openly relishing, as you can see here, the spotlight and sweeping about the set as if she were on a Broadway stage. Now, by presenting the character of Penelope Alvarez and her over-the-top mother, the show clearly tropicalizes Latinidad and clearly perpetuates the image of the exotic, sexy Latina. However, through the hues of humor and satire, the show self-consciously references the current trend in media to commodify Latinas. Here, I believe the show works through the presentation of a postmodern image culture in which identity is constructed through appearance and style. Especially the flamboyant appearances of the grandmother, La Abuelita, who is shown to live behind a curtain in the apartment, highlight the commodification of ethnicity only to subvert it when the audience's laughter puts an exclamation point at the end of every quip. Always making a dramatic appearance, by throwing the curtains aside, the stagedness of her appearance being underlined by the loud applause of the audience, Lydia self-consciously performs a traditional Cuban woman. And conspicuously, I believe, her Cuban accent is one of the most funny things in this show. Now, the first season of One Day at a Time, which aired or started to air in January 2017, aired exactly 2 weeks before Donald Trump's inauguration and 3 weeks before Trump signed the travel ban that barred immigrants from certain countries from entering the United States. Now, this sitcom, I believe, is political, negotiating some of the currently most burning issues in the United States. Now, in season 1, Elena's friends' parents, for instance, are deported back to Mexico. And in season 3, and actually the entire season 3 spends an arc on Schneider, who is Canadian, and the Cuban-born Lydia getting their citizenship. Now, when talking about the queerness of the show, I believe that it is, however, important to move away from the politics of representation that I think has dominated, especially the representation of Latinx on TV, and shifting the discussion to what Samuel Chambers has called the politics of norm. Looking at the possibilities of non-normative sexual politics, I suggest that we analyze the ways in which One Day at a Time actually manages to queer television by disrupting gender normativity, by drawing the attention to other forms of family, kinship, and also alternative forms of ethnicity. A norm, as Judith Butler famously has argued, operates within social practices as the implicit standard of normalization. As norms have no transcendent standing, but only persist, and this is a quote actually from Michael Warner's The Trouble with Normal, and only persist to the extent that they are acted out in social practice, TV has a tremendous influence in the daily reproduction and implementation of the normal. TV, therefore, participates in the social discourses on sex, gender, sexuality, and their intersections with race, ethnicity, and nationality by contributing to the codifications and normalization of gendered and sexual categories in the forms of heteronormity and cisnormativity. And this is a lesson that actually Elena, Penelope's queer daughter, teaches her family. In a lot of ways, the show is also educational. And she teaches this to her family when she introduces her friends to her family. And this is in season 2, episode 3. She introduces her queer friends to her family, specifying which personal pronouns her friends want to be addressed. So anyway, this is the advocacy group I was telling you about. Oh, this is too dark. I'm reading it out. The feminist gamers of Echo Park. And, you know, there's different people speaking here. Can't imitate it that well. We've been hanging out online, and this is our first meeting IRL. Welcome, says Penelope. What's everyone's name? I'm Danny. My pronouns are she or her. Sid. My pronouns are they and them. I'm Margot. Pronouns sie and zer. I'm Penelope, says the mother. My thoughts are, what? And what? Seriously, what's happening? Well, says the daughter, because some people are gender non-conforming, they have preferred pronouns. And here comes the punchline, of course. I'm Lydia, says the grandmother. Lydia. Yes, so now the audience laughs. Right. Now, Elena, although still young, she's 15, is very well versed in gender and maybe even queer theory, it seems. And the lesson she teaches her family and, of course, the viewers have the effect, I believe, at least of troubling the normal. Apart from this pronoun lesson, Elena also enlightens the audience on the X in the label Latinx. And this term, she explains, makes room for people who are trans, queer, agender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, or gender fluid. And as I've said, it is precisely these in-between categories that the show then engages. Elena's outspoken gender non-conforming views, together with the portrayal of Sid, her non-binary love interest, are certainly the most conspicuous queer features of this TV show. What's more, though, is that Elena manages to transform her family. Unyoking family and kinship from oppressing models of patriarchy, heteronormativity, and capitalism, Elena crafts a model of kinship which carves out a place for what Richard Rodriguez has called queer familia. The entire first season is dominated by the preparations and debates over Elena's quinces. This traditional celebration in honor of a girl's 15th birthday traditionally marks a girl's coming of age. Afterwards, she's considered a mature person. This traditional rites of passage shows that for queer Latinx, family is often a source of anxiety, and there is an obligation, so to speak, to be involved in family in a certain heteronormative way. And this is precisely Elena's dilemma in season 1. First, violently reacting against this celebration, Elena finds a way of subverting this tradition, making it work for her, so to speak. First, it seems as if she just gave in to her grandmother's wish to throw this party when she reluctantly puts on the white dress. In the end, however, her grandmother gives in and surprises Elena by giving her a beautiful white suit to wear. And this is what she then wears. In the culminating scene of season 1, Elena is supposed to dance with her estranged father. But when she and her mother realize that the father has left, the mother takes over and dances with her daughter. The couple is then joined by the younger brother, then the grandmother, and then Schneider, and ultimately, even Penelope's boss joins the group. When the camera zooms in on this group, it is clear that this is Elena's familia. The show thus posits a Cuban-American familia in terms of a queer diasporic community, which is based not on origin, filiation, or even genetics, but on destination, affiliation, and the assumption of a common set of social practices and political commitments. And I think this is a very important message. Based on affiliation, Schneider, in this way, the Canadian, remember, can be considered Cuban. In fact, as we see in season 2, he will learn Spanish, signaling his familial attachments and commitment. So let me conclude. Yeah, this is it. I have read this recent sitcom for its queer potential, as I would like to call it, and it's queer politics, showing that one day at a time does not only constitute some form, or allow some form of intervention into the racial ethnic politics of a Trumpian America, but also into the sexual politics of the time. The sitcom interrogates and tries on various ways and means of making familia, trans-ethnically, trans-racially. In this family, as I've said, we have a Cuban American family making familia with a white Canadian and a Jewish doctor. In this sense, I believe One Day at a Time interrupts those discourses that intimately link nationalism and heteropatriarchy as underpinnings of a compulsory, normative Latino-Latina family romance. Thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. We have about 9 minutes for questions.
Glad it wasn't that long.
I have a question about the genre. I guess this is much more, it's very much into the sitcom.
Yes.
Do you think that is there a reason for it to be in the sitcom? I'm not familiar, but I know that telenovelas is a big thing, right? So I'm guessing there's a cultural appropriation in the genre of what kind of TV series. But have you seen the same kind of discussion in dramas or in more, I don't even have the words to describe other series types or genres?
Well, I don't know who it was who yesterday said, I'm not really into sitcoms. And I think it was you, right? Yes. No, and it was the same with me. And I was actually quite surprised because I wanted to see the show. And I had read about it, as, happens so often when you actually, come at it from a kind of professional point of view. And then I was kind of surprised it was a sitcom, and I was like, oh no, I don't have to do that. But I actually really got into it, and I really thought that, precisely because I think it does engage the telenovela genre, and it does kind of like, sitcom, I think, borrows more easily. I think it really works with that show. But Ugly Betty, as far as I remember, is not. And there too, we have a rich engagement with a telenovela, which is, of course, a tradition that is really, really important because it is the dominant kind of genre in Latin America, and also, of course, in terms of dramatic quality and so on. It really, I think, allows you to use the telenovela, which I know, a lot of my students like telenovelas, right? And I think they can read even the quote-unquote straight telenovelas as kind of like parodies of the normal because they're so over the top.
Yeah, it's too much.
Yeah.
1, 2, and Jules.
Sorry, what order did you?
You're first.
Oh, I'm first. So yes, I was the one who said I don't like sitcoms, but that doesn't mean that people shouldn't like sitcoms. There are lots of interesting things. And I think that you're totally right about this one. So I have both sort of a comment and a question around the same topic, which is, again, something I mentioned in my workshop that I'm so interested in is the way that television is both constantly constructing family and the familial, but not in, but in multiple ways. And I think that what you were saying about sort of the structure of kinship in this is really interesting. There's also, I think, sort of on a meta level, the way that this program sort of has a familial relation to other things on TV, like the telenovela, that it sort of makes it, it brings it in like it's close cousin. But also, and this is what I'm curious what you think about, of course, it also has sort of a lineage to like Father Norman Lear, who incredibly interesting person in the history of television, I think, in terms of shifting what a sitcom could be, making the humor be humor around politics and topicality, and so much, for good or for bad, I think associated with opening up television from just the sort of white, middle class, heterosexual norm to different sort of racial, gender, and political configurations. So in some ways it's really interesting that it's a remake of a Norman Lear sitcom. Or do you feel like that keeps it too much in the lineage of like, we're indebted to our TV father? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you see that?
Well, frankly, I don't know. I mean, there's not only is there kind of like this direct linkage, but also, as far as I know, Lear was involved in the production of this show too, right? And so I think this was one of the reasons why they thought that this show would really fly and would really work, right? And we're all very disappointed that apparently it hasn't. And so maybe kind of like he was too close to it in a lot of ways, not only for people to recognize the similarities, but maybe it was kind of like an anxiety of influence or something going on here, right? I don't know. But if I have a little more time, I'd like to go back to those original shows and look at them more closely. But I don't know. I think the one of the hopes of the show was that kind of like by giving it this direct linkage, that would really kind of like help boost this show. And I don't really know why. I mean, when I started to work on this paper, it was still going strong, right? And then came the news, because this is really only 2 months ago.
And so in some ways I want to come back to what Lynn was talking about, because the thing that sort of strikes me is about One Day at a Time as a remake / reboot is this idea that on one hand the media industries really sort of function on known products, known talent. So there's that piece of it, but also and I've not watched this iteration of One Day at a Time, but Norman Lear, to sort of come back to Norman Lear is sort of the father of the turn to relevance in American television, which is sort of about rehabilitating, as Lynn said, like gender, sexuality, and such. And so I'm just sort of curious to I'm trying to figure out, without, of course, having seen the show, if the show is in some ways really departing from its DNA, or if it is just sort of turn to relevance 2.0.
Yeah. Well, that might well be the case. I mean, how would you determine that, right? Because, I mean, on the one hand, you almost have to go back to the 70s and see kind of, I mean, we know, right? The people who watch it right now don't know. I mean, no one I have talked to, but then I'm also not in the US. I don't know if they actually had heard of Norman Lear in that show.
But I mean, I'm just sort of talking about the sort of untethering of it from a historical politics of television.
Yeah.
Much of it's filmed in front of a studio
audience.
And I guess I find that kind of interesting. And I just wondered what you make of that. I mean, it's part of, I guess, the retro feel of the show, but if you have any more thoughts on that.
Well, when I watched it, I hadn't watched sitcoms in a long time. And when I first started to watch this show, I was like, oh, it's this canned laughter. And then I was giving the term canned laughter some thought, because canned laughter kind of is not a live audience, or is it? I don't know. Or do you still refer to it as canned laughter? I'm like, oh, no, wait a moment here. This is a live audience. I mean, of course, they have the cue cards, right? So please laugh now or something. But it does make a difference, I think. And but I haven't given this more thought than that. But I think you could make something out of it, because I think, again, if I were to pursue kind of the line of an argument that looks at it in what ways it kind of departs from the original version, then of course the liveliness of that audience could matter in different ways. One other thing that I find interesting is that even, Ugly Betty, which I now didn't talk about, is also a remake, and is also kind of based on all sorts of other versions of Betty La Feas and Ugly Betty and Verliebt in Berlin in Germany and so on. So I have no idea whether there is something to that too, that a lot of these popular Latinx shows in some ways or another have this retro thing going on. There might be something there too.
Yeah, I mean, live, I mean, doing it live now in front of a studio audience is one of those paradoxes where it actually highlights the fakeness of it, even though it's
Yeah,
supposed to be
yeah,
live.
yeah.
And I'm just wondering if that adds, that combined with this sort of the risk of tackiness and representations of Latina and Latinx culture, as you said, somehow those don't get mixed up. So.
Yeah.
Any other, maybe they have time for one more question or comment? Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.